I'm just going to quickly take us through the ground rules for this session, and then we're going to go to each of our 4 speakers. So as a reminder, we're here today to talk about the final of our 5 principles, human rights enjoyment. And just a few ground rules before we start. At Just Fair, we are really keen to make sure that all the work we do reflects the principles of a human rights-based approach, where everyone is respected, they can fully participate, where they don't experience things like discrimination. And in order to help us facilitate meetings like this, we do have a few ground rules that you'll all have received in advance. The first thing is that safety and well-being take priority. At some of these events, we will be discussing how people experience violations of their rights, and that can be really difficult. So we do ask all participants to take care of themselves in whatever way they need to. For example, if you need to leave the room and you want to come back later, whatever you do need to do to look after yourself. We respect and value difference. We all come to this virtual room with different experiences in our life and in our learning. And we think not only are differences a thing that exists, but they're a real strength, and they really add to the arguments we're making, and they really add to the world that we're trying to build. So we really do welcome different experiences. All opinions count. As I said, people are coming to this room with different knowledge, different experience, different kinds of learning. We know that learning comes in many different forms, and we're just so glad that you're all here to share your expertise with us today. This is a safe space for learning. I like to say that all of us are on our human rights journeys. None of us is perfect yet. We will get things wrong, but at Just First, certainly, and we hope you'll join us in this, we are committed to learning to do better, and also committed to trying to make this a safe space for when we do, all of us, get things wrong. As Just Fair, we will actively listen and improve. That's a commitment that we make to you. And part of that is that I do have a very short survey to share with you at the end of this session. And I'd really ask you to spend a couple of minutes to fill that in so that we can hear about how we can improve this kind of work. We also ask you to be respectful, and we'll work to be respectful too. We ask you to assume good intent from all of our participants. Don't interrupt, although that can be very difficult in the online space where you don't have the same prompts. And also respond to what's actually in front of you, not what you imagine somebody may have thought or meant. Finally, share the air. Take responsibility for helping everyone have time in the conversation, and be conscious of who has contributed and who hasn't had a chance to contribute yet. That's it from me in terms of ground rules. I just also want to tell you that our next session in the Human Rights Everyday Rights conversation will be taking place on the 17th of September. We're really delighted that we will be partnering with the Environmental Rights Centre Scotland for that event, where we're going to be looking at the issue of justice for people and planet. And we're planning to bring together human rights organisations and environmental rights organisations to think about how we can chart a better way forward. My colleague Alex is going to drop a link to that session in the chat where you can sign up. He's also going to drop a link for the resources page for this project, the feedback form that I just mentioned. And then finally, Just Fair chair the UK Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Network. If you're getting involved in or interested in getting involved in that, please do join us. So all that remains for me right now is to introduce our first speaker. I told you that would be a very quick introduction. So first up is Kate Ewing, and Kate is a researcher at Just Fair. Alongside her work at Just Fair, Kate is working on a PhD at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona, and the focus of Kate's work is work time and the minimum wage. Kate previously worked in London as labour rights solicitor, representing trade unions and their members. So I'll pass to you, Kate.
Thanks, Helen, and hi everybody. It's really nice to see so many people joining us today. I'm just going to try sharing my screen and then we can get started. There we go. Okay, so as those of you who have attended some of our previous everyday rights discussions may know, this is one of a series of events organised by Just Fair throughout 2024 to discuss incorporation of everyday rights into everyday life for everyone in the UK. And so, as Helen mentioned, we mean everyday rights like having a decent job, having a place to call home, a place to learn and pursue education, and being able to enjoy good physical and mental health, amongst other things. And by incorporation, we mean not only the legal frameworks needed, but all the policies and mechanisms surrounding that to make sure that people actually experience their rights. So this is really an opportunity to think about how we bridge the gap between the promises of international legal protections and the reality as it is experienced by people in their everyday lives. And so to help us do this, Just Fair has developed 5 principles to guide the discussions that we're hosting. And we hope that through this process, we can gather together all of our expertise and ideas to think about how we can best achieve the goal of rights incorporation across the whole of the UK. I'm not going to go through all 5 principles now, but instead I'd encourage anyone who hasn't been to the previous sessions to check out our online resource page that Helen mentioned, that Alex is putting into the chat, and also sign up for the upcoming sessions as well. But very briefly, the 5 principles are rights knowledge, rights frameworks, rights resourcing, and rights accountability, and rights enjoyment. And so the focus of today's session, of course, is that 5th principle, rights enjoyment. So what do we mean by rights enjoyment? Well, at Just Fair, we think rights enjoyment means turning, as I said, the promise of rights protection into a reality that people actually experience in their daily lives. And so that's about recognizing that the work of decision makers and duty bearers is never done. Ensuring rights enjoyment requires an ongoing process of learning, evaluation, reflection, and progressive change and improvement. It means ongoing assessment and revision of the use of resources and compliance with international frameworks on the maximum use of resources and rights obligations. And the critical test really is how rights are actually experienced by people, the rights holders, in their day-to-day lives. And their participation in the evaluation of the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights across the UK will also help identify gaps in areas for improvement and change towards better rights enjoyment for everyone across the whole of the UK. So I think today's discussion is going to be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers, and looking forward to also hearing from all participants. And with that, Helen, I'll pass back to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Kate, and for really laying the groundwork there. I'm going to now introduce our next speaker, Nick Cook, and Nick is a disability rights activist. She works at Difference Northeast, campaigning to centre the expertise and experiences of disabled people in decision-making, in policy, and in practice. So I'm going to pass to Nick.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Kate, as well. I'm going to share some slides too, just to support some of the stuff that I'm talking about. I'll also talk a little bit about some principles, but hopefully that won't mean we get all principled out. Hopefully they'll thread in nicely to what everybody else will be talking about too. And I suppose the focus from my end is primarily around the participation of rights holders and how we can make sure that that's happening. So Difference Northeast are a disabled-led organisation based in the Northeast, working to make the Northeast a more equal and better place for disabled people to live and work. We take an intersectional approach, and we know we can't think about disabled people as one homogenous group. We know that disabled people have worse outcomes compared to non-disabled people across the board, including being more likely to live in poverty, less likely to be in education or employment, were disproportionately affected by homelessness, face barriers to accessing health and social care, and public transport can quite often be disastrous for us. We know that if you're disabled and marginalised in other ways, that you're more negatively impacted. And then if you live in the Northeast, where I'm based and where Difference do most of their work, outcomes start getting worse for you again than elsewhere in England and the UK. So this first slide contains a quote from a participant in a study that we did, looking at how disabled people can participate in health and wellbeing activities in Stockton. I think it was funded, the research was funded as looking at disability and healthy weight. And it reads, when you go out as a disabled person, it's generally all eyes on me. That can stop you going out. Sometimes it's okay. Depends how you're feeling. If you're feeling strong enough for it, then it's fine. But if you don't, then you just don't go. And this was a kind of common thread that was coming through that research a lot about how you can provide something, but then if these kind of societal barriers aren't broken down around that, then you still can't fully participate. And sort of almost as an analogy for enjoyment of rights, but also very practically in terms of being able to enjoy your right to health and participation. So we very much talk about centering disability justice as imperative to kind of the process of rights enjoyment, and make sure that it's happening and not simply a hopeful outcome implemented and devised usually by those with little experience of the kinds of barriers that disabled people must navigate, or those that bar us from enjoying our everyday rights. So the work that we do as for and with and by disabled people in the Northeast focuses on how we can create cultural change and truly centre and not simply prioritise disabled people in decision-making processes. I want to really talk about the Disabled People's Manifesto, which, if you haven't heard of it already, it's a manifesto ahead of the general election, I suppose, co-produced with deaf and disabled people's organisations from across England. And that outlines the need for transformational change and for government to institute sort of radical reform to tackle disableist policymaking and the systemic oppression and injustice that comes along with that, to create a society where everyone has equal life chances, that we're valued and we're treated equally. We all want to live in an inclusive society where everyone has a fulfilling life and that we feel connected and valued. I think these are really, values reflected in those economic, social, and cultural rights. Disabled people know that our lives aren't valued equally to others. We experience discrimination and oppression in our daily lives, and these wider macro disabling societal barriers to our inclusion and full participation. So that manifesto argues that we need strategy that's co-produced with disabled people and our organisations from across the country, and it delivers fundamental reform to enable disabled people to thrive in enjoying our rights. So at Difference, and possibly more locally, we kind of outline this approach. It has these three principles, and they are understanding the needs of disabled people, including disabled people in decision-making, and how best that will work. So that can help ensure that accessibility and inclusion is really at the forefront. And then 3 is prioritizing disability justice. So as an outcome and a driver of the plans and processes, and for thinking about this conversation particularly, those processes to evaluate and reflect upon rights and enjoyment. So how can we prioritize disability justice as an outcome and driver of that? So some of those needs, understand the needs of disabled people means including disabled people in decision-making in actual ways, not as consultation processes or exercises. We must understand, for example, if you're disabled, you're more likely to live in poverty. The welfare system should provide a financial safety net for disabled people and those with long-term health conditions, and at a level that we can live independent lives. Yet we know that since 2008, changes to welfare benefits have led to huge failings, causing disabled people to be and feel abandoned by a kind of cruel and unfair system. Leaving disabled people hugely negatively impacted by those welfare reforms. Disabled people often face higher living costs anyway, related to things like needing extra energy and fuel. That might be for charging equipment that you need to live. It might be because you need to heat your home more than a non-disabled person. It might be because you have to pay extra transport costs because your local public transport system isn't fit for purpose or is inaccessible. And having much less income due to being unable to find accessible work that works for you. So we need to be aware of that often direct but hidden sometimes links of not being able to enjoy our right, for example, whatever that might be, safe, secure housing, and then the ripple effect that has on being able to enjoy our rights to work, education, health, and so on. Including disabled people in decision making. So the quote on this slide reads, "It's not enough to simply ask us about plans that have already been made. Disabled people need to be included in decision-making process and our lived experience utilised to remove the barriers that we face on public transport every day." And this is from a Difference member. The image is from the organisation Wheels for Wellbeing, who are a London-based cycling campaign organisation. And it shows a person using a hand cycle trying to navigate a chicane barrier unsuccessfully. So this just highlighting the kind of the way in which infrastructure is designed poses so many barriers to disabled people enjoying their rights. And many of these access failures are a result of political or financial decisions, but also because disabled people aren't permitted space to those decision-making and design processes initially. And it can be no less than an ordeal trying to navigate public transport across the Northeast if you have access needs at the moment. So when we prioritise disability justice in practice and use it as a measure, we can vastly improve life for disabled people. Not being able to enjoy our rights and participate is never because of our disabilities. This slide, just to wrap up, is a quote from another Difference member. And it reads, "I can't tell you how many times I've been out with people where I've had to turn back, either on my own or with people I was with because of my disability. Lifts constantly out of order, gaps you need to step over, but no ramps." And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. That was just packed with so much and so much to think about in terms of both the perhaps more obvious barriers that exist, like you're saying, in terms of the benefits cuts that have happened, and perhaps a kind of sliding scale to some of the less obvious, to, as you say, non-disabled people, like those societal barriers. I'm going to pass now on to our third speaker, who is Matthew Egan. And Matthew works for the trade union UNISON, where he helped to develop and roll out the Ethical Care Charter as a way of improving care standards for care recipients and terms and conditions for care workers. He also works on trying to address the problem of non-compliance with the minimum wage in the social care sector. So over to you, Matthew.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about our trade unions' experience on working in our social care system, and more specifically our home care system. So for those of you not familiar with the home care sector in the UK, it consists of over 500,000 workers, primarily working class women, who work to help keep disabled and elderly people in need of care living independently in their own homes. So the service used to be directly provided by local councils across the UK, but now it's almost completely outsourced, with councils commissioning in excess of 10,000 individual private employers to deliver the care. Collectively, there are billions of pounds of public money spent on paying these private providers to deliver the work. Although simultaneously, of course, local councils have endured major funding cuts from central government, which has added pressure to the workforce. So in what is almost a wholly privatised system, deprived of adequate public funds, with a fragmented, atomised and largely non-unionised workforce, it became really apparent that home care workers were routinely being deprived of one of their most basic employment rights on a massive scale, and that's the widespread problem of non-payment of the national minimum wage by virtue of home care workers routinely not being paid for all their working time, because the time that they spend travelling from visit to visit is often not paid for when it should be. And conservatively, it's estimated that around 200,000 home care workers are paid illegally low wages every week. So alongside this breach of one of the most sort of basic employment laws, stood all sorts of other problems, like the widespread use of zero-hours contracts, poor training standards, and a lack of time to actually provide care and even do something as basic as have a meaningful conversation with someone. So issues which made life miserable for the workforce, but also had a clear and negative impact on the standard of care for the elderly and disabled people that were in receipt of care. So HMRC, the departmental organisation responsible for enforcing the national minimum wage, and come under the remit of the government's business department. And for many years, we tried to engage with HMRC and the business department directly to try and get them to enforce the basic right of home care workers being paid for all their working time. I'd sum it up as saying that HMRC essentially said that the cases are too time-consuming and complex. They don't have the resources, and I don't think they have the desire to address the problem and really tackle the sort of structural problems that contribute to the problem. Whereas the business department and other associated central government departments like the Department of Health and Social Care just simply don't have any interest in improving the treatment of care workers. So our complementary approach was to develop our ethical care chart, which is a short list of basic standards that we wanted councils to ensure that all their home care providers abided by whenever they came to commission their contracts. So this included simple things like ensuring that travel time was paid for, enhanced rates of pay, no zero-hours contracts, continuity of care, better training standards, and no 15-minute visits. So things that were good both for the care worker and for the people in receipt of any care. So since its inception around 10 years ago, we've had about 50 councils adopt the charter, and that's out of around 207 councils in England, Wales and Scotland that are responsible for delivering home care services. So in theory, that means thousands of care workers being paid for all their working time, along with those other improved terms and conditions. So given we've had a Conservative government with no interest in reforming social care or tackling widespread workplace rights abuses, we felt we had no other option but to try and engage with local councils to get them to play more of an interventionist role. So in theory, it looks like it's been a success, but there have been problems with the implementation and enforcement of the charter. For some councils, it's simply been a positive news story or a thought opportunity for them, and little more than that. Often contracts haven't mentioned the charter when they've come to commission new home care provision, which can obviously limit a council's ability to enforce the standards within it. Councils have also suffered from a lack of capacity to oversee contracts and the delivery of them. We've also had another issue in that some councils only agree to adopt the charter by virtue of political agreements between sort of council leaders and senior UNISON officials. So that can often result in the workforce being bypassed and often resulting in the fact that they're totally unaware of it. But on a more positive note, we have had some experiences where the charter has been fully built into the commissioning process and steps were taken by the council to ensure that it's been enforced, like reviewing pay slips of care workers, actively surveying the workforce engagement with the workforce either directly or through the local UNISON branch. And what we found is that when the workers themselves were involved, genuine enjoyments of those rights were always more pronounced. So it's clearly been a major challenge. Clearly a lot of councils who've not sought to engage with the charter and are happy to sort of leave the delivery of home care services and the sort of resultant rights afforded to the workforce out of mind and out of sight. So in conclusion, I'd say that the biggest lesson I've learned during the campaign is that whilst there can be a bit of value in some top-down initiatives like this, and whilst it's imperative that there are effective national enforcement agencies who can apply necessary penalties to when basic rights are bypassed, you ultimately do need to have an organised, unionised workforce who know what their rights are and are confident enough to assert them, particularly in such a fragmented and isolated workforce like the home care one. And that's it from me. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Matthew. And like, that was just absolutely fascinating in terms of this exact thing. Obviously, we are thinking about bringing in new laws, but one of the things we're very conscious of is that laws as they do exist aren't being properly enforced, and how we kind of do better in the future. So that was a really, really great example, and a really very, very honest example of what's working and what's not. So hugely appreciated, Matthew. Our final speaker in terms of introductory remarks now is Dr. Koldo Casla. Koldo is a senior lecturer in international human rights law at the University of Essex. He is the director of the Human Rights Centre Clinic at the same university, where he also runs the project Human Rights Local, seeking to make human rights locally relevant in the UK. So I'll pass to you, Koldo.
Thank you, Helen. I would like to use these few minutes to present a project that I run at Essex called Human Rights Local. I don't have a presentation, but I have a couple of links that I'm going to share here in the chat. Alex, I think I sent them to you because I cannot share with the whole group, but Alex, if you don't mind sharing it with everyone else, that would be great. Human Rights Local is an attempt to, as Helen was saying, to make human rights locally relevant, to connect human rights, the idea of universal human rights with the realities of people on the ground in different parts of England. It is also an attempt to respond to two books that were influential to some extent in certain circles, published in the last 10 years or so. You may have heard of these two books, or one of them perhaps. One of them is a book by David Goodhart, published in 2017, called The Road to Somewhere. Published in 2017. It's important this year because remember, it was the year when Donald Trump was entered into the White House for the first time, maybe. And it was also soon after the Brexit referendum. And the thesis by David Goodhart in this book, in The Road to Somewhere, is that the biggest political cleavage of our times is not class, is not gender, is not age, is rather the fight between the anywheres and the somewheres. He says the anywheres would be people who are cosmopolitan, who earn more than who are in the top half of the earners at least, who subscribe to international newspapers or journals, or read outlets from all over the world, who are highly educated, so sometimes speak multiple languages. People who live in London but could live in New York or in Johannesburg or in Tokyo, it doesn't really matter because their identity is not dependent on place. They could live anywhere, hence the name. And then on the other end, we have the somewheres, David Goodhart said, and the somewheres will be those for whom their identity is dependent on place. People who earn less than most, people who are not highly educated, people who speak one language, and people who live somewhere because they could hardly live anywhere else. They all often live in the same place where they lived or nearby, and their identity is dependent on place. And Goodhart argued that both Trump and Brexit were an expression of the revolt of the somewheres versus the anywheres. A few years earlier, an academic wrote a book called The End Times of Human Rights. His name is Stephen Hopgood, and the thesis of The End Times of Human Rights is that there is another dichotomy. Academics sometimes like dichotomies because it's a very simple frame. So just like Goodhart talked about the dichotomy between anywheres and somewheres, Hopgood talked about the dichotomy between human rights capital letter and human rights lowercase. Human rights lowercase will be the grievances, perhaps the everyday rights, as Helen put it, but not necessarily only social rights. It could be anything, any concern that we might have that we could frame in the language of rights can be, any grievance can be a human rights lowercase. But then we have human rights capital letter, which for Hopgood are the institutions of international law and international politics, without which we cannot really articulate in international legal discourse the lowercase human rights, such as the UN Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Council, the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. You get the idea. All these bodies, all these special rapporteurs, all these documents, and so on. And Hopgood's thesis was that capital letter human rights are approaching the end times. Lowercase human rights, not really, because problems are going to remain. Well, Human Rights Local is an attempt to test these two propositions, in fact, to challenge these two propositions. Both the proposition that there is a fundamental clash between the somewheres and the anywheres, which, by the way, for Hopgood, for Goodman, I forgot to say, human rights will belong to the anywheres. The somewheres will not really
Sorry,
be
can you please
interested.
slow down your speech? I'm really, really struggling to understand you.
Speak slower. Yes, I'll try. So human rights would be for the anywheres, not for the somewheres. Good had said. So Human Rights Local is an attempt to challenge these two ideas. It's an attempt to question the idea that human rights only belongs to this supposed cosmopolitan intellectual elite, and is an attempt to question that there is this dichotomy between lowercase human rights and capital letter human rights. That there is a fight between the institutions and the concerns. So with Human Rights Local is a project that we launched in 2020. You have the link there. And we've been involved in a number of initiatives that also involve Just Fair. And lately, last year, we published a study with ATT Fourth World on how child protection services in England affect, in particular, families in poverty. It's an open access article, and I'm not going to give details about the actual research. If you want to ask me about it, I can tell you a thing or two, but you can also find about it on the website and also in the article. But what I would like to say one or two things about is about the approach and the lesson. What I learned the most from this process and from the project Human Rights Local in general is this issue of epistemic justice. And by epistemic justice, I mean whose opinions matter. I think, Helen, in your ground rules, you said at some point that learning comes in different forms. And that's something that we academics, but I think we human rights practitioners in general have to spend much more time thinking about. What sort of knowledge we value and how far we're willing to transform our practices to acknowledge that there is certain type of expertise that comes from experience, not so much from books. As important as books are, I devote my time to them, but as important as books are, as academia is and all the rest, there is an effort not only in protecting rights, but also in changing the profile of who is becoming a human rights activist and defender. So that's what I mean by epistemic justice. It's about transforming how we understand, how we produce knowledge. And we talked about this in the article, and I'm happy to say more later if you want me to. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Koldo, and I really would encourage you to click on and read those links that Koldo shared, because it's absolutely fascinating work. So a huge thank you to our four speakers. That was some really excellent foundation thoughts, and I'm really excited now to jump into the 4 questions that we had set for everybody. Just as a reminder to everyone that we do have closed captions enabled, so if anybody needs those, they can use them. And also then for those of us who speak very quickly in their local accents, like those of us in Northern Ireland, we need to remember to speak a little bit slowly and more clearly so that the captions can pick us up. But I am going to jump straight into our first question, and I welcome contributions on this from anyone, from any of our 4 speakers, or from anybody else who's participating. And please just raise your hand and we can come in. But the question is, what systems and processes for protecting rights already exist but aren't working properly or being used properly? How do we make duties on decision makers effective so that they protect people's rights? Are there examples of laws which could be made more effective, more protective, with minor amendments or different implementations? And I'm just going to post that into the chat as well, so everybody has it. And Rona, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was trying to respond to Nick's comment about the captions. When people speak too rapidly, the captions suddenly become very nonsensical. For example, you talked about Judy's just now, according to the captions. You didn't say Judy's, you probably said something else, but according to the captions, you said Judy's. I think you probably meant duties, but the captions very easily distort. And if somebody is speaking a million miles an hour, it isn't just the accent, but it's the rapidity of speech that distorts the captions. The accent is one thing. I can work out what a person is saying in a different accent. My hearing isn't that bad. But if somebody is speaking really quickly and I'm relying on the captions, it can be a real struggle to actually understand what's being said. So I had to say something halfway through the last presentation because it was getting ridiculous. The captions made no sense. I couldn't understand what he was saying. So my apologies for interrupting, but it was very frustrating to be on a meeting for people that are disabled in some way and for me to not have full access. So I just want to sort of explain that the captions are not the be all and end all for people who are hard of hearing. I also have a condition called receptive dysphagia, which basically means that my auditory processing has been messed up by having had a stroke. So sometimes people will say words and mean certain words, and my brain will hear those words completely differently because the auditory processing is not what it should be. So if you kind of add to that the distorted captions, it can be a real nightmare on Zoom. But I think you're personally doing really, really well. And just wanted to pass that message on to Nick and the others and just, just be mindful.
Hi, Rona, and thank you so much for that reminder and for letting us know exactly what the issue is. And just to say, I think the accent and the speech patterns are two very different things. I think Northern Ireland, we speak much more rapidly, so it's just perhaps a reminder, and I'm separating out the accent and the speech patterns there. But thank you for the reminder on that. On the first question, does anybody want to come in on things that already exist but aren't working properly or aren't being used properly?
Can I come in again? Because I wanted to make a comment about Nick's presentation, which I caught the tail end of because I had another call to make to speak on first, and it was the fact that we have a so-called welfare state and a so-called welfare system in place that is not working properly because as a result of so-called austerity measures, which is a political choice, it was not essential for the banks, and as a result of that, a lot of disabled people have died. And when I say a lot of disabled people have died, I mean either they've decided to end their own lives and commit suicide, or they've starved to death, or they've gone without insurance, such as the case of David Clapson, or basically they hadn't had enough food to eat and then they withered away and they starved, or they died because of lack. They died for various reasons because they were found fit for work. Under the work capability assessment, a lot of disabled people were found as fit for work when they weren't fit for work, and then they would die of a heart attack several weeks later or so on. And when I say a lot of disabled people, I'm saying that since 2010, it's estimated, according to Disabled People Against the Cuts, that about 300,000 disabled people have died. In 2015, I was a carer for my mother. My mother passed away. Then I had to give up carer's allowance. I had to give up my income support, and then I had to sign on. I went to sign on, and I burst into tears in the assessor's arms, and I was told to apply for ESA. I went through the work capability assessment, and I was told that grief doesn't count, and I was found fit for work. And had it not been for my friends supporting me, I would be dead now because I wouldn't have had an income for about 5 months until my PIP was actually awarded. So that, I think, is a really good example of a system that is in place that is not working. And of course the system is going to be changed even further after the next general election. The Conservatives have plans to curtail that system even more. So I just wanted to make that as a contribution because I think it's a relevant one.
Thank you so much for that, Rona. So the way in which what we would maybe term as the right to social security, the way that these things are received by people, the systems and barriers that are in place that actually stop people receiving their right to social security. Did anybody else want to come in on anything else, that things that already exist but aren't working properly, aren't being used properly? Matthew?
Yeah, so I can give a simple example following on from my talk, in that in theory, all employers in the UK are actually obliged to prove that they are paying their staff the national minimum wage. So the obligation is on them rather than on a worker to prove they're not being paid properly. But in reality, in the care sector, especially in the home care sector, where the majority of staff are employed on 0 hours contracts, it's that issue of a significant power imbalance existing, in that you, as an individual care worker, you might not even see your colleagues from 1 week to the next. You might not be, probably not in a union. So you've got to try and challenge your employer if you think that you might not be being paid properly, knowing full well that that employer can withdraw your hours of work, and obviously all the knock-on effects that that has. So yeah, which just gets back to my point that it's the power is the key thing, and obviously from our perspective as a trade union, you need that collectivization in order to build up that power to be able to actually have meaningful use of some of these workplace rights.
Thank you so much for that, Matthew. And yeah, I think we also spend a lot of time in the human rights sector reflecting on power, but it's been interesting, I think, as well, how much trade unions have come up through our discussions of these 5 principles. Chan, you wanted to come in?
Hello, yes, thanks, and thanks for the really insightful presentations from everybody as well. I was just thinking when Rona was mentioning about social security, around also how people access that social security in terms of so many things now being online, and the barrier to, you know, digital access, to data access. So it's like, you know, the unemployment benefit or whatever benefit it is there, but you actually need to have a computer, you need to have access to data, you need to be able to have literacy, language skills perhaps to access that. So it's this idea that these things are there, but we can't access them. And I think the NHS is another example of that, in terms of just surgery access, and this idea that you can have an appointment in 10 weeks' time, or you can ring and ring and ring and not actually access the service. And as an example, in terms of, I think, young people's and women's sexual and reproductive health rights, I was told that the waiting list for gynecological support was 12 months for women in the area where I live. So you can imagine, if you've given birth, if you've had anything happen, the 12-month wait. But in theory, it's there, that, you know, the system is there. But it's the access, I think, is a big challenge. And I think if we can look at how technology is eroding that, I understand that in some instances it's supporting that access, but how can it support that access better? And can we please keep the systems that for people who don't have the technology access to be there as well? So
Thank you so much for that, Chan. And actually, I seem to remember a few years ago, Difference Northeast had some really interesting evidence on, I think it was work during the pandemic, and this because they were looking at the idea of the internet and digital access, and how actually it was you, I think, Difference Northeast, that being able to work from home had, because of digital access, had opened up new gates for disabled people, but at the same time this need to be weighed up against the barriers. So like you're saying, Chan, for example, digital access isn't just a good or a bad thing. We actually need to consider the impact it has on the people in the given situation. But Koldo, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, thank you, Helen, and apologies because I will need to leave earlier because I'm supposed to attend an event that began 3 minutes ago. But two observations in response to your question. In the report I mentioned, which is also elaborated in the paper that Alex provided the link to, we talk about the issue of proportionality test in child protection services in England. We talked in the research with a lot of social workers and also young adults who had gone through child protection services and young parents, mostly young mothers of children. And one of the observations was the issue of taking in the assessment of proportionality, the importance of taking into account resource, material conditions of the family and so on. But also taking account of the fact that local authorities, this is one of the most important chunks of the budget, really, the money that they spend on child protection services and social care in general. And local authorities have been cash strapped for 10 years or more. So often the response that you will get is that, well, there is no money. And that is, to some extent is true. And, simply saying that, more money needs to be invested is obviously true, but it doesn't really solve the problem immediately. But one of the issue that was presented was the issue of prejudice based on poverty, which other people call povertyism. The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty calls povertyism, or some other scholars call aporophobia, so the hatred to people who are poor. And one of the examples that was presented to me while doing the research was this case of a mother with a young child who this child was coming up to nursery with some bruises on his forehead, and it happened once and twice, and the mother would say, well, he's just playing a little bit rough in the playground and that's why he's getting the bruises. But she was not believed, and she was reported to social services, and after a few instances, the social worker wrote in the report, there is nothing wrong with this family, leave them alone. And that testimony for me was quite impactful, because at the time, around that time, I took my own daughter to nursery on a Monday morning, and she had a bruise on her knee, you see, and it was, it was very visible. And one of the people working there asked me, so what happened to her? And I replied, well, playing rough in the playground. And I know immediately that she just believed me. She didn't question me. I knew that was the end of it, really. I told her the truth and she believed me. But there was something that made the other woman not believable. And I wonder what that could be, if not prejudice. So that's one point. The other point I would like to make, unrelated, is that I think we need more principles like the one established a few months ago by the UK Supreme Court in a case called Imam v. London Borough of Croydon. And I'm giving to Alex the reference. This is a case of access to housing for people who are unintentionally homeless, and that's the term of the law. But what matters is not so much what the case is about, it's more the principle. In this case, the UK Supreme Court, which is not, is not the avant-garde of progressive thinking, but the UK Supreme Court established the principle that if the right is recognized in the law, local authorities cannot argue that they don't have resources. The moment Parliament creates certain legal expectations, resource constraints must be a secondary consideration. We need to find resources based on recognition of rights in the law, not the other way around. And the principle was very forcefully presented by the UK Supreme Court, but as far as I know, is an exception, really, not the rule. We need more positions like this one in relation not only to this particular issue of homelessness, but other issues on housing and indeed other social rights matters as well.
Thank you so much, Koldo. And Kate, did you want to jump in, and then we might wrap up and move on to the next question, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. The point I think is a really important point that Chan raised about how things can exist, in theory, but actually accessing the rights or accessing the protection is a real issue. And I think that ties into what Matthew was saying as well, which is that in relation to care workers, you know, as he explained, you know, you have care workers who technically benefit from a reverse burden of proof where it's on the employer to show that they're paying correctly, but because of the circumstances of the workers, it's very difficult for them to articulate that, for them to ensure that they receive the minimum wage, which of course is something they're entitled to both in domestic law and under international law. And you know, there is actually a sort of fairly clear-cut way of addressing that, which is a front-loading of rights, but front-loading them practically in a way that can address the power imbalance that Matthew talks about, the pressure on individuals having to enforce rights that they're entitled to, rather than the people who owe the obligation complying up front. And in the case of the minimum wage, what's quite interesting is there's a good example, I'm sure we'll find many examples in other pieces of legislation, of there is a provision in the Minimum Wage Act which would enable regulations to be made by the government, which requires employers to print on pay slips how they say they have complied with the national minimum wage. And that would make things a lot easier for workers. It would make it much more clear cut where an employer is breaching their obligations. And so I think that idea of like requiring people who owe a duty, owe rights, obligations to actually have to demonstrate compliance in a front-loaded way, rather than always being the person who should be enjoying their rights having to go around chasing after people who owe them those duties. And that was the point I wanted to raise.
Thank you, Kate, and that's like a really brilliant practical example. I'm gonna move us on to question 2 though. Thank you all so much for the input on question 1. And it's, what are the examples of good practice or good initiatives that we are aware of and we could use to build upon? So we're interested in where these things are happening. Doesn't necessarily need to be in the UK, but it can also be in a very tiny small space. We're interested in how they are working, and we're also interested in why they're working well. So again, I'm going to pop this into the chat so everybody has the text of that. Does anybody want to kick us off? And Koldo, actually, because I know you do need to leave a bit early, but if there's anything else you want to say on any of the questions, don't be constrained by my 1, 2, 3, 4 format.
Sorry, you'll be constrained by the 1, 2, 3, 4 format. What does that mean?
As in questions 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Oh, okay.
So does anybody else want to kick us off on that first question? Examples of good practice that they're aware of. We're trying to think of the positives. Go ahead, Rona.
Yeah, I was unemployed for a number of months from November to April, and good practice for me was my local authority having a really strong cost of living support network in place in regard to not just food access and kind of like weekly kind of access to food banks, but also giving me legal support regarding referrals to citizens advice, and also money to pay my bills and live. And I was terrified of going in universal credit because it meant I'm currently receiving housing benefit, and universal credit is a far more restrictive system, and there is a lot more conditionality. And I was pretty confident that I was going to find employment, so I tried to resist getting on universal credit for as long as possible. Yeah, so the system in my borough, the system worked really well in terms of if you're in a situation where you can avoid going onto universal credit and you have some if you can access food banks and you have some freelance employment coming in, which I did, I was able to survive without a regular steady income for almost 6 months, just based on the support systems that were in place in the area I live in, which is Islington in North London. So yeah, they're doing some things right, I would say.
I'm really glad to hear that, Rona, and thank you so much for sharing. Does anybody else want to come in with that good practice? Laura, you've unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say two things on Rona's point. I've heard of Coventry Council writing off debt for people in certain situations, because that would ultimately create work for their housing team, and it could lead to eviction and other things. And so some local authorities are understanding the interconnectedness of various issues, and that it's not just the right thing, but it's also an effective way to sometimes do your work. And then secondly, and this is, I guess, good practice in the it's in the making, but so I'm from the Law Centers Network, and there was recently legal win in court by Kirklees Citizens Advice and Law Center on DWP discrimination case. Now, I think there've been quite a few wins on this topic, but in terms of improving practice, I think that's, and Rona, you mentioned PIP and other types of welfare benefits, and how there can be a successful judgment, but the practice in individual law center job centers doesn't actually improve. So we've created a working group to bring together disability discrimination lawyers within the network. We're a network of 42 law centers, and to make sure that we send letters to individual job centers and create an approach where we put the pressure locally, and as well as nationally, to make sure that this that the judgment does get implemented and practice does actually change. So it's work in practice, but I think there is something about, you know, holding those institutions accountable.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. And again, really great, really practical examples. Anybody else want to share anything about what good might look like in their knowledge? Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, so there's not a great deal of good positive practice in the care sector. So I don't know if people will have seen the sort of media coverage of this sort of quite serious and significant increase in the abuse of migrant care workers. So the number of migrant care workers in the UK has significantly increased recently after the government made changes. But unfortunately, there are a lot of care employers, some completely bogus care employers who've just been set up to try and exploit the migrant care workers. There's been a real increase in like really shocking abuses, like people are being asked to pay tens of thousands of pounds to get jobs here, effectively being held hostage by the employers. So again, to sort of linking back to my talk, is that we have had, again, a few examples of proactive local councils actually taking steps to try and intervene more in the care sector in their local area by sort of auditing any care provider who might be using migrant care workers, because yeah, sadly, it is the attitude we've had. I know obviously we've got a potential change in government coming up, but the attitude is that it is out of sight, out of mind. These are jobs often delivered well away from the public eye, and sort of willingness to sort of just let these abuses flourish is really striking, and it does require more efforts from organisations like local councils to try and take steps to deal with the problems.
Thank you so much for that, Matthew. And I just want to say Koldo needs to leave in a minute. So thank you so much to Koldo for joining us. And I also have a comment in the text from Koldo, but I'm going to let Nick jump in first, and then I'll read out probably in your absence, Koldo. But thank you so much for being here today. Okay, Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Koldo. Just a small comment as well, which relates to kind of what everybody has said there, particularly to Rona and Chan as well, about accessibility. So whatever practice that is, it needs to have robust accessibility standards applied to that, which means kind of co-producing those policies and programs at national and local level with disabled people and our organizations who, you know, tend to hold this expertise around accessibility, and not just thinking about accessibility in terms of using assistive technology, for example, but for having, you know, if we think about digital accessibility, as Chan was saying before, that this has the, you know, this rounded kind of circumstance of, do you have access to the means by which to access the digital world? And then do you have access needs on top of that as well to be able to access these digital communities and events and conversations like this? And apologies, Rona, for speaking at 90 miles an hour before. And making sure that communication access, including languages, is fundamental to any of those practices and processes.
Sorry, just to say goodbye. I really gotta go to another meeting, in another building. Sorry, I had to go early. Bye-bye.
Thank you for being with us, Koldo. And on that note, I'm just going to read out the comment in the chat from Koldo. A good practice would be in relation to housing to create different, higher legal obligations for large and small landlords. And then open quotation, analysing the proportionality of an eviction entails examining not only the consequences of measures for the evicted person, but also the owner's need to recover possession of the property. This inevitably involves making a distinction between properties belonging to individuals who need them as a home or to provide vital income, and properties belonging to the financial institutions, as in the current case. And that's from a case by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Lopez Albin versus Spain in 2019. Does anybody else want to come in on that, what good looks like? Otherwise, we're very timely in moving on to the next question. Chan, yes, please come ahead.
I just thought I could offer an example that I saw this week in relation to employment, and it was the Smallwood Trust, and they were advertising for a role, a senior role, and they wanted people with lived experience. And what they did was they teamed up with a recruitment agency that focused on Black and different ethnicities to offer a recruitment conversation in advance of the application and to offer to review CVs. And they also offered, and I've seen it with some other organisations as well, offering a call. So in the run up to the application, a call with the, you know, the person who would be the manager or the CEO, so that people who may not usually have access to that network or to get that conversation can actually have that conversation. And I thought that was a brilliant example of, I mean, this was obviously a trust, but I think if private sector organizations could also do that, it would be a great way to you know, this access to employment and rights, and to do it in a way that's it's a bit easier to go along to that call, maybe with some other people, you know. And so I thought that was a good example that could be replicated. And alongside that, I've seen in the private sector where they go above and beyond. So for example, with pensions, not just offering the minimum 3%, but recognizing that if you want people to come into these roles who may be more disadvantaged, maybe offering 10% might be a brilliant way to level the playing field and to help people access their rights better in that sense of, particularly where people are less likely to be able to have a full pension and things like that. So I think there's a lot that could be done from the Equalities Act side in terms of actually making that reality much more than what is currently being done in many instances of tick box type things.
And I think that's so right, Chan, when you're talking about the tick box, and just what you're saying just reminds me so much of what Nick was saying in terms of the societal barriers that exist. And then I'm making the leap to say, when Nick talks about the importance of involving, for example, disabled people and disabled people's organizations in these processes, because as a non-disabled person, I might not actually understand those barriers that do exist, and therefore having the people who have the direct experience can really make the difference. And that's the people of experience of many different types of barriers that exist. But thank you, that's a really great other practical examples of this. So I'm going to push us forward a little bit. Rona, sorry, did you want to come in on that one?
No, I just wanted to just comment on what you just said about being a non-disabled person and not being aware of the barriers. And one of the things that I'm currently doing for a living is escorting people who are non-disabled or identify as non-disabled on various transport journeys. It could be trains, buses, tubes, whatever, railways, and then escorting them by virtue of the fact that as a person who uses a walking frame, who has a hearing problem, just basically communicating to them as a facilitator, communicating to them exactly what the issues and barriers are that not only myself would face, but a person who may be neurodiverse or learning disabled or visually impaired, and all the barriers that they would face, so that they actually get a first-hand sense, or as close to a first-hand sense of what it's like to commute on public transport and be physically or mentally or emotionally impaired in some respect. So it is a course that's being made available for transport staff, but there might be a similar course that you could look up that might be available for people who aren't necessarily connected to transport. But at the moment, it's being trialed with staff who work in sort of the back rooms of transport, like operations managers and so on. So I just wanted to flag that.
Thank you, and that's a really great example of, again, sorry, Nick, you were going to come in. You're maybe going to say a lot better.
Just to comment on that, as helpful as those exercises can be, at Difference we're kind of fundamentally against those kind of exercises, because we don't think it gives an overview of exactly the kinds of barriers that we face, as useful as they can be on that instant of trying to turn up and travel to get to a platform at a train station and find that you can't actually get there at all, and your rights are completely being removed to be able to just turn up and go. But actually that doesn't give a wider we don't think those exercises give a wider understanding of like how it is to live as a disabled people, and those kind of barriers that you experience on a societal level that also impact your ability to, for example, travel on transport. But we recognize that they can be useful at times.
Thank you so much. And so we're going to move on then to the third point, which is where we kind of dream a little. What would good look like in terms of the enjoyment of rights in the short term, the medium term, and the long term? So what is the ideal scenario? And that's a big question. So to focus down a little bit, is there one change you would like to see, and what difference could it make? And I'll post it in the chat once again while you have a little think. But please just raise hands. Jump in, please, Nick.
Hi, apologies. I feel like I'm taking a lot of airtime now, so please just jump in, others too. But I just wanted to read something out from the Disabled People's Manifesto, which calls for transformational change. We want plans for every aspect of life, including energy policy, climate change, digital and technological development, health, housing, transport, street environment, and emergency planning, to address specific needs of disabled people from the outset. Segregated settings and programs should not be a default. Choice, control, and inclusion are vital. Disabled people should have support to live, learn, and work in the community. And I think that speaks very loudly to enjoyment of rights.
That was wonderful. And I've noted down choice, control, inclusion, because I think that's a really excellent kind of guide. So thank you for sharing that, Nick. Matthew.
Yeah, I suppose one key change I'd like to see is sort of for that interplay between public sector funding and commissioning and the ability for rights to be enjoyed, to be properly recognised. Because, like I said, in the home care sector alone, billions of pounds of public money are spent to ensure these services are delivered. So if you extend that across the wider public sector, the amounts of money are vast. And again, purely looking at it from workforce rights perspective, simple steps could be taken to sort of like penalise any employers that flout those basic rights. So like if, for instance, a care company was found to not be paying their staff the minimum wage, then every public body that has a contract with that employer could just have those contracts removed. Genuine penalties applied to these organisations that are just willing to widely flout basic rights. So like simple joined up steps like that would be something relatively simple that could be done to try and ensure that some of these rights are actually meaningfully enjoyed.
Thank you so much for that, Matthew. And yeah, joined up thinking, joined up working, and genuine penalties. I always remember when the GDPR came in and the fear within, I was working at an even smaller NGO at the time, and the fear of those penalties, as well as obviously the desire to protect people's rights, people's privacy, how quickly we all suddenly became experts in GDPR. Does anybody else want to jump in on that, how we get good? And that can be like Nick's looking at like really fundamental huge changes, or like Matthew was suggesting like some actual really genuine, like just practical changes that can be done right now. Matthew, is that a legacy hand? It is indeed. Okay, so we do only have 15 minutes left. Sorry, go ahead, Nick, you were going to speak.
Sorry, I should have raised my hand. Again, I think just coming back to this idea of who gets to have a place in the conversations, who gets to, and I'm usually quite careful about using the term co-produce and co-production, as I think it is filled with kind of misconceptions and misunderstandings now. But, you know, to co-produce whatever those changes are is fundamentally really important to disability rights, disability justice, because of the fact disabled people are so often excluded from those spaces. So, you know, something co-producing, again, this is taken from the Disabled People's Manifesto, but co-producing a benefit system that recognises everyone's right to an adequate standard of living seems so kind of basic that, you know, that isn't already the case, but co-producing that would be huge.
And I also, Nick, I really like the way you talked about disabled people and disabled people's organisations as being key to that. And a number of years ago, we produced guidance with Greater Manchester Poverty Action that looks at the practical steps for implementation of something called the socioeconomic duty. And in that, we kind of were suggesting similar, because these are two slightly different audiences. I think the actual rights holders themselves, but then the organisations that are hopefully very genuinely representing them, but the organisations tend to be able to hold a bit more of the institutional knowledge over the years and be centre points for learning, which hopefully has taken some of the burden off those individual rights holders. And of course, that is hopefully a very supportive relationship, but I do think it's really interesting. I would really agree with you on the importance of both those kinds of individuals and groups being part of that kind of consultation process. And also what we talk about when we talk about consultation, where consultation begins, are they designing the system itself and not just coming in as, you know, people who are asked to give their opinion on a one-off occasion. On that, talk about not sharing the air myself. How do we get to good? So what are the steps that need to be taken, and also who needs to take them? What are the things that need to be in place as a foundation for us to build on? And finally, what particular groups or communities do we need to think about to make sure barriers are removed? Go ahead, Chan, thank you.
I was just going to say about things in place. I think it's really important we recognise people as human and where people are, and the invisible barriers in terms of, particularly in terms of capability to speak. So we may invite people in, give people platforms, but if somebody doesn't feel safe to speak, then we're not going to hear their voice. And I think that's, as a foundational thing in any kind of ways forward that we go, we have to think about how do we, to make things more inclusive for whoever we're working with or in partnership with. What are the foundations that need to be in place for that person? And are we meeting those in order to get that engagement? And I think that's something in the work that I do a lot of work in equalities. It's always a question, and often we're limited by, institutional constraints, but how far can we go beyond to, and, one example is, going to where people are. So going to, there's a great organisation that works with men, and they go to, in South Africa, they go to the pubs to talk about violence and domestic violence. They go to the pub to talk to the men because they recognise that that's where they are. So I think it's thinking about things like that and how we can upturn the way we do things to get that engagement, and particularly also when it comes to young people, when it comes to older people, and obviously recognising that not all older people and young people are the same, that we've got lots of differences in terms of all the different identities we hold, but trying to think about that, so when we're setting things up, we can go to the different groups, I think, and create spaces that work for people.
Thank you so much for that, Chan. That's a really great reflection about, meeting people where they are, sometimes quite literally meeting people where they are, but like ensuring that also, I remember there's Patricia McKeown, who works at UNISON in Northern Ireland, often talks about that analogy of it's not just about who isn't round the table, often it's the table itself that is the problem. So who's not actually in the room to be able to sit at the table because the table doesn't make sense for their lives. But over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, just reflecting on Nick's point around the need for sort of genuine co-production, because obviously we've got a general election next Thursday, like a probably strong possibility that there's going to be a Labour government who, in relation to the social care system, have talked about bringing about something called a national care service, so like genuine reform of the care service and steps to genuinely improve workers' rights. So whether that actually happens or not is sort of another matter. But just reflecting on the fact that if it's only UNISON as like representatives of the workers around the table, having that conversation with the government, and groups who represent people in receipt of care, so whether that's disabled people or elderly people, if they're not part of that same conversation, if it's only looked at through the prism of just what does it mean for the care workforce, then yeah, it's always gonna fall short of having genuine and lasting impact that's needed.
Thank you so much for that, Matthew and Nick.
Yeah, absolutely agree with Matthew and Chan's points there, which I think were really related to. And just, you know, it is that if we want to make sure that people with, you know, lived experience, always in inverted commas, but if we talk about disabled people, which is what I'm talking about today, but if we want to make sure that disabled people are central to the process, then we need to make sure we're prioritizing access and inclusion and disability justice as a wider scope of that, and that those very processes are made accessible and inclusive, whatever that looks like, to whoever is taking part. Otherwise, they don't allow the space for us to take part at all, let alone enjoy our rights in that. And being very cognizant, conscious of who is at those conversations, who is in this conversation now, who's at the table talking for or about or around what the issue is, or are we making space for people to tell their own, you know, stories about how things can be different.
That's another hugely powerful reflection. Folks, I think we're almost ready to wrap up. It feels like, did anybody have any final comments or thoughts that they wanted to share? Okay, I want to say a huge thank you firstly to our speakers, but also to all of the participants. I think this has been one of the most kind of reflective sessions that we have had. I feel like that I'm sitting very deep within myself as a result of this, and I know I'm going to go away and do a lot of thinking this evening. So thank you all so much for that, and for the really respectful way we kind of got through some of that discussion. So please do tell us what you thought in the feedback form, but also come to our next session so we can think about human rights and environmental rights and how we bring those together to actually build a brighter future. But for today, just thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. I just hugely appreciate it. Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.